The UCI recently disqualified 5 teams from the Women's Tour de Romandie over disagreements due to GPS trackers attached to riders' bikes. Speaking to Escape Collective, Jonathan Waters explained the disagreement surrounds how the GPS trackers were going to be attached to riders' bikes and specifically how those riders were chosen. It's a little bit more nuanced argument than simply them not wanting the GPS trackers and boils down to broader issues around who owns data and how they can monetize that data. But this kind of follows a long line of pretty controversial decisions made by the UCI, including some rulings made back in June, which certainly set the pro cycling world astir. And that is the subject of today's podcast. We're going to take a look back at what's happened this year to date around the UCI's rules and take a slightly broader look at the rules we would like to see changed. And joining me today in that endeavour is Simon von Bromley and Ollie Smith. It's going to be a very good one. These boys know lots and lots about UCI rules, so stay tuned for more. Of course, this is the news podcast, so we will be bringing you as well last week's top performing content on BikeRadar and our rant of the week. Before we get stuck in though, I'd love to hear how my wonderful boys are doing today. And let's start with Ollie Smith, since he's fresh into the Radar team, so people actually want to know what you think.
Yeah, what, you want to know how I'm doing?
Yeah,
I'm doing fine, thanks, Jack. How are you?
that's very gentle. That's very nice.
Got any pithy anecdotes to share?
You clearly haven't done a pod yet.
What do you want? What do you want from me?
Sour sort of, wry comments about how we're slow and old is typically how me.
That's what we do. So yeah, if you want to go,
I'm slow.
I'm feeling fantastic and
old.
fast.
I feel sprightly. I feel great. My back is in great shape. No, I was sick as a dog on the weekend, so I feel a bit tired. But yeah.
Stay away, Simon. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Glowing from a little bit of time away riding in the Lake District. Went up for a little family holiday, and my parents live in the North Lake District. Very, very good. Took the gravel bike, of course, because it's the summer holidays, and the tiny, narrow roads of England are, as you would guess, filled with SUVs at this time of year. So, yeah, it was fantastic. I'm not in terrible shape. I was quite pleased to have a little go on a climb and got a rare top 10 on
a highly contested segment.
I don't know if it is that highly contested because it's an off-road climb on Windlatter. You can go look it up and knock me out the top 10, I guess.
I was very pleased though to see Simon was keeping his hand in on BikeRadar, because even though he was off, we did discuss a little bit of top content performing on the site last week, and of course that's why he's here, because he cares. Anyway, let's get on to the subject of the day, and we're going to talk through the rules as we see should be changed by the UCI. And we're going to start off with by far the biggest talking point of this year so far: handlebar width. So cast your mind back to June. The UCI introduced quite sweeping reforms to its tech regulations, and among these was the new rule that would mandate handlebars had to be no narrower than 38 centimeters. Slightly narrower as measured at the hoods, but 30 centimeters overall. Massively controversial, and if you read our excellent reporting at the time, something or decision that was made without real consideration, or certainly with no consideration from the UCI as to how this would impact women and smaller riders. There's been lots said on this subject by us, others. I think of all the rules the UCI has certainly recently introduced, this is the one they absolutely must backtrack on. Ollie Smith, I'd like to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. It's something that they should definitely backtrack on. I think
next step.
There we go.
Next
Done.
point.
Next. No, I think mandating changes to bikes that affect riders' fit is really dumb. I think the rules they have in place about shifter angle, I think, is really relevant because you're changing the way riders are interacting with something, and they're interacting with it in a way it's not designed to be used. So, like when you're on the drops and your shifters are tilted all the way in, the brake levers aren't as easily accessible, for example. But bar width is really arbitrary in most cases. The really narrow bars, like when riders using track bars outside, 22 centimetres and stuff like that, I can imagine that changes the handling of your bike a bit, but still not quite as drastically. And I think, I just think it's really stupid, basically. There you go.
I think the whole thing with this is that the UCI claims it's been done to improve rider safety, but have supplied no data, no kind of rationale behind this, again, quite fairly arbitrary limit. And crucially, that limit is going to unfairly disadvantage smaller riders who, generally speaking, will benefit from having narrower bars. And when we published this original story, our source at the time said that Cervelo's teams, or his team I should say, 14 of the 18 women on the Visma Lisa bike team would need to change their handlebars. So clearly, that's bike fit that they've done to be as well optimized, comfortable, safe, whatever as possible, this is a change that doesn't take into account those riders. Simon, you've obviously said a great deal on this. You are also Mr. Narrow Bar. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think the way that the rule is implemented is just really bad. I don't necessarily have a problem with them mandating a narrowest handlebar width. And just to correct you, I think it's 38 centimeters center to center at the hoods will be the minimum. It's 40.
Sorry.
40 centimeters outside to outside is going to be the new minimum. Doesn't really make that much difference. But as you say, that's going to be too wide for a lot of people. Personally, I don't see why they haven't done something that is proportional to riders' heights, as they have done with, say, the amount of reach you're allowed on a time trial bike, or the amount of angle you're allowed on a time trial bike, for example. They have what they would call morphological exemptions.
Ooh, great
for riders of different heights with time trial bikes. So I don't really understand why they couldn't have had that here as well. The advice from bike fitters, we've seen people like friend of the BikeRadar YouTube channel, Bike Fit James, who has kind of expressed his kind of doubts about the new rules and basically saying that it's going to make smaller riders, maybe women, smaller men, just more uncomfortable on the bike, and could potentially also kind of compromise their handling because they're having to reach their kind of hands and tilt their hands out in an unnatural way. I don't know if the UCI will back down on it. They don't have a history of admitting that they are wrong. So
yeah,
and we're kind of coming up to the end of this season, and we've not heard anything from them saying, well, we're going to look at it. Thanks for all your feedback. It's just been complete radio silence.
Yeah, I think Ollie said something really good in last week's podcast where he described, if they did backtrack on this, they would regain a great deal of social equity. Good word, Ollie. I think they would really gain a lot by admitting, actually, we've got this wrong. But they had the information at hand when this decision was made. Certainly from what we've been told, our source said they were very closely involved with the overall discussions, and they were ignored. So, I just do not see the UCI backing down on this. And this will be quite a common theme throughout our points where, one, yeah, they are definitely not going to back down on this. But two, as far as we can tell, a lot of the rulemaking is quite arbitrary and removed from what riders actually want or need.
It is literally like having a minimum seat height.
Yeah.
Changing, dictating what width bar riders can use, especially on the smaller end. Because, bigger riders aren't really going to be affected as much. But the women's peloton and smaller men, 38 centimetres is so wide compared to what a lot of them are using. It's literally like saying you can't have your saddle lower than 70 centimetres and then watching people sort of try and pedal.
But the funny thing is, again, we have morphological exemptions for things like saddle placement. There was that whole rule about your saddle has to be 5 centimetres behind the bottom bracket, famously to deny a Scotsman.
Oh, really?
From I'm not sure if you've heard of that, Jack, but there was a guy called Graham Owbray.
Oh, yes, he is Scottish, isn't he? Yeah.
Who attempted the hour record, and there's a good film about that called The Flying Scotsman, and a funny scene of him sawing the nose off his saddle and then presenting it to a hapless commissar. But shorter riders were entitled to an exemption from that rule. You could have it up to 0 in line with the bottom bracket, as long as you didn't have a certain level of reach beyond to the handlebars, etc., etc. So there is precedent for the UCI having morphological exemptions for riders of different shapes and sizes. So I think the fact that they've chosen not to do that in this case just shows it. Well, I don't know what it is. It just kind of beggars belief, really. It seems really unusual.
Does it? Anyway.
Well,
on to our next point, and this one is going to be a rule, possibly, maybe, but it's still worth dwelling on here. So later on this year, the UCI is going to trial gearing restrictions at a test event with an aim to potentially reducing overall rider speeds, which the UCI believes to be a key problem for rider safety. Rider safety is a really key talking point. It is definitely, if we're being kind, the spirit in which these decisions are being made. Of course, how they're being implemented is a whole other point. But anyway, they want to reduce rider speed. They're going to reduce gearing. I think this one is dead in the water before it's even been trialed. Dan Bigham, friend of the BikeRadar podcast, has done some really good analysis, real math stuff, where he's basically pointed out that the gearing in an average race, or the gearing restrictions in an average race, will have such a small impact on such a small portion of the race that it's just not going to make a difference. And as others have said, including Tom Pidcock, leveling the playing field, if they're all going to be going at the same speed, is actually going to be more dangerous because they're not strung out across the road. But really all this boils down to is it's just not a problem. That gearing restrictions are not going to solve the issue. And even Simon von Bromley has worked out workarounds for how people get around this. So it's just not a rule that I think has any legs. Do either of you disagree with me?
No, I completely agree with you. I think the implementation of this is going to be the problem, where the UCI has basically said they're not going to check tyre size. And it's like, I'm sorry, but tyre size affects rollout.
Yeah.
So if you turn up with, the same 5410 top gear, or whatever the maximum, 5411 top gear that is allowed, if you have a bigger tyre, for that same one rotation of the crank, your bike will roll further with larger tyres. So you have to measure tyre rollout. If you're not going to, then the whole rule is a complete waste of time. There's also things like crank length as well, where Sheldon Brown termed it the kind of effective gain ratio, and that when you switch to a smaller crank, it feels like you have bigger gears because you have less leverage. Now, of course, the rollout remains the same, but there could be a new kind of most effective tactics where you switch to a smaller crank and then you end up spinning that bigger gear at a much higher cadence, and therefore you can just go as fast as you were previously. And there are no, unlike with handlebar width, there's no limit on how small you can go with cranks as things stand. Maybe that'll be the next thing they do. Don't want to give them ideas, but I think gearing restrictions have been proposed by some people. Wout van Aert and Chris Froome kind of came out and said that they thought that could be a good idea, but I think it kind of misses the point that I think the increasing size of gears in pro cycling is kind of tangential to the increase in speed. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but I actually think most riders are using bigger chain rings because they want more efficient drivetrains rather than because they want more speed, because riders already had massive gears. When SRAM came out with their 10-tooth sprockets on their cassettes, when it launched its Axis group sets, those came out with really small chain rings, but they still provided a gear that was equivalent, a gear ratio that was equivalent to what riders had been using previously, whether that was 5311 or whatever. But riders didn't want to use the 48 tooth chain rings that came with those, or 50 tooth chain rings that came with those bikes. Partly because they were worried about seeing that that's a really small chain ring and that's not very cool, but also because there are measurable efficiency losses from friction that you get from moving to smaller chain rings and smaller sprockets at the rear. And so, having a really big chain ring up front and using a slightly bigger sprocket at the rear is just faster. And it's got nothing to do with gear ratios. And I think again, it's like it kind of feels like the UCI doesn't really understand what the problem is, and hasn't presented any data to suggest that this change will have the impact that it says it will.
Of course, if we're being kind to them, we should say it's a test event, and perhaps that will be the outcome of it, that they say, no, it didn't make any difference. But clearly the analysis could have been done ahead of time, and it's just created all this discussion we're talking about in this podcast, and it's a distraction from what are much bigger issues. Ollie, you're a man who's come up through the racing ranks. I'm sure you've done your time. Would you advocate a return to junior gearing for the pros?
Well, the one thing I'd say is juniors on junior gearing doesn't mean they're slow. I've raced against juniors, and I'm nearly 30, and I still race against juniors, and they
are fast.
Are very fast, regardless of their gear restrictions. I think since we last spoke about it, I listened to Jack Burke's How to Be a Pro Cyclist podcast. He had Dan Bigham on, and they were talking about this. And Jack Burke was just throwing every possible scenario where this could be a good thing at Dan, and he was just batting him away with his well-researched kind of obviously knows what he's talking about. I think the main thing he highlighted, which you kind of touched on then as well, is the UCI have equated speed with danger, but that isn't necessarily the higher speed is not necessarily the cause of more danger. And there's 100 other things that cause pros, like that create a lot of risk and create a lot of danger. And limiting gears, as we've said, is not going to really change the speed that much. It's just going to change the gear that pros are riding in. That's going to be further down the block. But it distracts from the real issues like road furniture and racing on stupid narrow roads to keep a mayor of like some tiny little French village happy, which is not appropriate for putting 180 riders through. Like, it's another one. I'm going to just say it's stupid a lot with this, but it's just really dumb. And I do think it's crazy how far this has gotten off the back of no like evidence or anything. And then also, this is a test event. So how do they determine the success of the test? If there's no crashes, are they going to say, "Yep, cool"?
Yeah.
Because of the gears.
I mean,
they haven't outlined the failure or success.
I think they've kind of said what they're going to do is compare the speeds of this year's event to the speeds of previous events. But of course, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, there's a tailwind.
Well, exactly. And but also we all know that tactics affect the speed of a race. You know, if the peloton soft pedals all the way to a sprint finish, then that could be a really slow race. But likewise, if it's attacking from the gun, it also depends what riders ride the event. If the best riders in the world ride the event, then of course like it's going to be a faster event than if someone doesn't. And the variables of weather, like what happens in the race, like it just is, it seems crazy. I feel like you'd have to, even if you did a kind of like year-long trial of it, because of the way that weather affects things and kind of race conditions, it would be impossible to draw accurate comparisons year to year and say, this has had an effect because of this.
Yeah. Although this, I should say, one thing that kind of I dwell on with this is it doesn't really impact day-to-day riders, really, in the grand scheme of things. But it kind of does. Like the way that pros ride and the equipment they use, people ape the pros, whether they like it or not. They are hugely influential in the shape of tech and what people do. People like Ollie who are actually racing, like all this stuff actually does matter. But more to the point, like the UCI's rudderless direction with this stuff doesn't really present a position of confidence for brands and those who want to be involved with the sport. And it'd be really foolish of the UCI to pretend that cycling sponsors aren't an enormous part of the sport. And SRAM are likely, if this is implemented, to be really disadvantaged in that their whole gearing ecosystem is based around gearing, which would be illegal, technically, if the UCI banned it. It's madness, and it's no good thing for the sport to have sponsors kind of messed around in this way. Like even, we haven't not going to discuss it in today's podcast, but the whole bike design limitations in terms of rear ends, like those Hope track bikes, hugely influential track bikes, massively successful, lots of money poured into them, they're going to be made effectively redundant by these changes. And yes, there's questions around like teams who have more resource and blah blah blah, but like again, I just think it's so shoddy for all this effort to have gone to developing everything to be like, see ya, that's out the door.
I mean, that's one of the things BikeFit James mentioned, that it was, previously in years gone past, really hard to get handlebars that came in sizes narrower than 40 centimeters. Now, as pros have kind of explored this stuff, it's actually become much, much easier.
And accepted, I would have thought.
And accepted, absolutely. But if that's all going to go away, and these brands, because the proteins won't use them, you won't be able to get a sub 40 centimeter handlebar for the next specialized tarmac or whatever. As you say, it may only affect the pros in terms of like racing results, but a consumer rider, if Specialized doesn't make that handlebar because of how things are going in terms of proprietary fit and stuff like that, you might not be able to get it either. So it kind of, it could end up affecting us.
Yep. On to another subject, and this one is absolutely nothing new. In fact, I think we could dine out on content on this for an entire year and we would never get tired of it. But the UCI weight limit, a near mythical figure, 6.8 kilos, has been around forever and ever and ever. Has been discussed forever and ever and ever. But I think it's high time that we should reconsider the UCI weight limit, but not for the reasons you might think. So, Ollie Smith, we had a good discussion about this in last week's podcast. Lay out your case as to why you think the 6.8 kilo rule should be culled.
Well, I think, as with many rules, it is a flat rule for everyone, and it unfairly disadvantages riders on one end of the size spectrum. In this case, obviously, much, much smaller riders. Had a chat with Ashley Morgan-Passio about it, and she said her thinking, and obviously there's no evidence behind this, but it's a pretty sound theory, is that the reason it's a 6.8 kilo weight limit is probably because that's about 10% of the average weight of a rider when they decided what the rule is. 68 kilos is, average weight. There's riders who are 48 kilos, and for them, riding a 6.8 kilo bike is a much, much bigger percentage of their overall mass compared to a heavier rider. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but it's a meaningful amount. And she gave me some calculations up the Col de la Madeleine, and it's like for two riders putting out the same watts per kilo with I think it was a 10 kilo body weight difference on the same weight bike. It's like over a minute. So Col de la Madeleine, obviously from the Women's Tour de France, that was sort of the pivotal climb in that race, and we saw Pauline Ferrand going for a Cervelo R5 rather than an S5, whereas Vingegaard in the men's tour was using the S5 for most of the race, even though it's a little bit heavier. Yeah, I just think it's another rule that needs to be updated. I think it came in place, didn't it, because the UCI was trying to discourage brands from making stuff dangerously light.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was like done in the spirit of the time. Actually, I don't even know when it was introduced to the Six. It's a long time.
I think it was it around 2000 with the Lugano Charter?
It's like early carbon, isn't it?
Yeah, early carbon. Things were definitely like being pushed in terms of the limits, and things could have got quite silly. You know, look at UK hill climb bikes. That's clearly something you do not want to race a Grand Tour on. It's not unfeasible to think bikes could have got to that position. But fast forward to today, to use a good timely reference, that Trek Madone that was out the other day, it was a bit of a test case project, one bike, bit of a marketing exercise, but it's still demonstrative of where we've come. That's a proper aero bike-ish. 6.8 kilos without a great deal of effort or custom parts or anything. Like, things have moved on quite a lot since then. And also, I don't know, like, women are taken into account with design decisions sometimes these days, when I think they probably weren't back then. I don't think the UCI is particularly a good case for that with the handlebar rule, but, you know, it's fair to say that it does probably unfairly disadvantage women more so than smaller, well, there's fewer smaller men than there are lighter women generally. So that alone is a good enough reason to drop it. Simon, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it would be good to drop it just in terms of a kind of development thing. Now, this is one, funny enough, when we talked to Dan Bigham, he was advocating for heavier bikes because they would potentially be safer, less likely to break in a crash and kind of all of those things. But I would like to see, better safety standards that mandated, minimum strength levels and all of that sort of stuff, rather than just saying, it just has to be 6.8 kilos. But I also think that with kind of bikes like the Tarmac SL8 kind of and Canyon Aero getting under 7 kilos, close to that UCI minimum weight limit, there's not much room for proper climbing bikes anymore in the World Tour. And so, as you said, the R5 didn't get used by the men's Visma Lease bike team at this year's Tour de France basically at all. We had all that spin about why it was so light and how it was so amazing, and then it didn't get raced. Now, that might just be rider choice. I'm sure it is an excellent bike, but if the UCI weight limit was lower, then there would be a more meaningful choice. If it was 6.5 kilos or even 6.25 or something, that extra 500 grams is something that would give riders a more meaningful choice between the climbing bike with shallower wheels and that really kind of weight weenie focused build versus a kind of heavier aero bike. Now, of course, you could still make a bike that kind of bridged the difference between the two, and I'm sure we would see many brands doing that. But again, it might just spur a little bit of development in a kind of period where a lot of bikes are starting to, and this often happens, but bikes are kind of converging around a kind of similar style.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the previous point. It is admirable that the UCI promotes the primacy of man over machine in all of its endeavours. But again, bike brands are what make the pro cycling world tick, and if they were given incentive to like genuinely shake things up in a meaningful way, bring new products to market that are quite revolutionary, I mean, like making something lighter is hardly revolutionary, but it would definitely encourage a new era of bike design. That would be a good thing for the sport overall. People are going to continue to build bikes, whether we like it or not, whether it's good for the planet or not. New bikes will be developed, but to give people renewed focus, I think would only be a good thing. And my goodness, would it be good for BikeRadar's clicks? That would be terrific. On to another point, and this relates back to our gearing comment earlier. So the UCI currently mandates a maximum wheel plus tire size, basically the diameter of the wheel and tire put together. Now, the spirit of that rule is okay, but its actual implementation and the effects it has is actually a little bit flawed, particularly in the era that we're in now, where tires are getting bigger and bigger. Simon, you have some good thoughts on this one. I'd like to hear your proposed change to this rule.
So, to give some context to my opinion, an interesting tidbit was when our wonderful editor George Scott spoke to someone from the Lidl Trek team about Pirelli's 40mm road bike tyres.
Moped tires, practically.
Yeah. The guy, because we asked, are you guys going to use them at the classics? And they said, no, we can't, because using them would make the total circumference of our wheels like too big for UCI regulation. So that actually you couldn't use tyres that large on a road bike in a UCI event. And I don't know if the UCI has different rules for gravel. I don't think they do.
They mustn't, yeah.
But then it would be interesting to know if basically all of the bikes used at the UCI Gravel World Champs are technically UCI legal because the tyres are too big.
I don't think the UCI have any rules.
No, but you know what I mean? So the UCI just doesn't check, is what I assume. If that is the case, I apologise to the UCI if
Notes
that's
for
incorrect.
later.
So, yeah, I think it would be fine to say limit the wheel size that you could use. 700C wheels are fine, and as we've seen with, I think the UCI has already said it's going to limit the use of 32-inch wheels in mountain biking.
I don't know if there's a final statement on this, but they were certainly investigating preemptively banning them, which again, I don't necessarily disagree with the spirit of it, because much like in the other direction, smaller handlebars disadvantage, well, actually bigger wheels might have a significant advantage that taller riders can only take advantage of.
Although likewise, taller riders might say they are disadvantaged by smaller 700C wheels, wouldn't they?
It's very true.
This is the crazy.
Who sheds a tear for the tall riders, though?
But let's say we could stick with 700C rims, but then just allow, maybe tyres up to a certain size or whatever. Because I don't see the value in saying that riders can't use 40mm wide tyres, for example, because they, using a larger tyre or a narrow one, there are positives and negatives to it. Yes, maybe you'll get better compliance over rough roads, but you also have to carry that extra weight around. And I think it's fair if you're going to allow riders and teams to select what tyres they use, which we do. This is not a formula sport where the kind of tyres are a set thing given to all teams, then I think that should be a choice that's open to them.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with that. What do you reckon, Ollie? Would you yearn for a future where you could put 40mm tyres on your SL8?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think it definitely seems a bit outdated, doesn't it? And yeah, Pirelli's a perfect example of like race tyres that are in 40mm and how that would make races like Roubaix and things like that. I guess would it make them safer, having more rubber? You always see the shot, don't you? Someone in Arenberg carrying their bike and their tyres blown off the rim.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it would certainly make it less safe, I'd put it that way.
Yeah, I think it just seems like a bit of an outdated rule, doesn't it? And then you get bikes being designed with way more clearance. So it's another rule that's like limiting innovation. But then, I mean, how old is that rule? Is it a new rule?
That will be probably
a pretty old rule. Yeah.
So they're going off.
I think a lot of that was that not limited originally to the Hour record bike, the one with the big giant rear wheel.
So for those who weren't around in the year 2000, unlike old people like me, although I wasn't really engaged with the sport then, but the Lugano Charter basically came in to kind of put an end to this like all loads of kind of wacky technological stuff that was going on with riders using different size front and rear wheels and weird frames. And if you look back at kind of TTs from that era and our records, it banned most famously perhaps like the Lotus bike that Chris Boardman used, so the kind of one-piece carbon monocoque frames that used to be quite I was going to say popular, but successful and kind of iconic is maybe a fairer word, and he kind of enshrined the fact that you had to have the kind of double triangle diamond shaped frame, for example, and various things like that. What a fantastic piece of cycling history.
Maybe an article, an explainer on the Lugano Charter would be.
Yeah, I mean, if you search the BikeRadar archives, as I love to do, I'm sure you do the same, Ollie.
Absolutely.
There are articles, like say interviews with people from the UCI explaining the Lugano Charter and things like that. Obviously, BikeRadar. When did BikeRadar come into existence?
2006.
2006. So it wasn't around, unfortunately, in 2000 to see the birth of modern cycling technological rules. However,
it's not far off.
We've been covering it for a long time.
I imagine that somebody from the UCI engaging with BikeRadar. A topic for about 15 minutes time, I think. Helmet regulations. So among the sweeping changes in June were some quite vague rules around helmets. Now, Simon, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think effectively what the UCI was stating was that helmets that were marketed for TT use were going to be banned for road racing. And also there were some rules potentially around like minimum number of events, this kind of stuff. It's all basically a bit vague, the changes that the UCI are proposing to helmet regulations, but you think there's a better way forward.
So the UCI hasn't actually said how it's going.
I
So
see.
what it has said is it's going there will be, and we're in late August now, with no clarity on what it will be, but there will be a distinction drawn between time trial and road helmets. Now, a source that we spoke to suggested that it was put to the kind of people involved in these discussions that it could be that anything that is marketed as a time trial helmet, so Visma Lisa Bike's Giro Arrowhead 2, for example, POC Tempor, would be banned in road racing, and that they were also considering something like a minimum number of vents. Now, the difficulty with this is that obviously marketing can be changed. The original Giro Arrowhead was originally marketed as a time trial helmet when it launched in 2015. I believe Rowan Dennis rode it to the fastest ever at the time Tour de France time trial that year, wearing the original Giro Arrowhead 1.
Wow, great bit of Simon flexing big time.
Yeah, we won't talk about what's happened to him since. But now the Visma Lisa Bike team is wearing it as a road helmet in road events, and Giro doesn't really market that helmet anymore. But in theory, if there was demand for it, POC brought back the Tempor after kind of discontinuing it when it kind of resurged in popularity. There's no reason why Giro couldn't bring back the Arrowhead one as a kind of road helmet. Again, with the venting thing, POC's Tempor helmet has 3 vents at the top, so.
Is that enough?
Is that enough? And those are quite big vents. But if you look at a cask TT helmet, for example, they often have just like 3 tiny little slits just at the front. And
what is a vent anyway?
Yeah, what is a vent? How big does a vent have to be? These are. You can't just say it needs to have a minimum of 3 vents, because then you could have just 3 tiny little lines. And I think on the cask helmets, those are basically there to just kind of stop that build-up of low pressure that can often slow a helmet down that has like a completely solid front. So just having, this is something that Xavier Disley told me of Aero Coach, that having vents there can be quite useful, because it just allows the airflow to carry on and not get stagnant in that area, and sort of create a low pressure zone that slows you down. But if these things are not like rigidly defined, you're just saying 3 vents, it's not enough. And
that's kind of where the UCI is now, though, in a way, where all the helmets have to do is conform to like relevant safety standards, I think is the wording they use, and it has to fit within a certain box.
And that's for road and TT, and that's why, the Giro Arrowhead 2 or the POC Tempor, anything like that, you could technically turn up. I've got the POC Tempor in my pocket right now, Ollie. I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to race it this weekend.
Yeah.
And you would be perfectly within your rights to do so.
You would be chastised for looking like a fool, but
I think 6 months ago you would have been. But now, I go to races and there's more people wearing TT helmets than not. And it's changed so quickly.
I think most visibly for me, I love Campanart smashing about in that helmet.
Yeah.
That visor. Is it the Arrowhead?
It is the Arrowhead, the original Arrowhead.
So good.
I think the problem with this rule for me is that the UCI is saying they're making all these changes because they want to make the sport safer. The gearing restrictions, the handlebar width thing. As we said, that's a really laudable aim, but they are changing the helmet regulations purely on vibes. There's no evidence that time trial helmets are any less safe than a standard road helmet. Now, I've recently done some testing with a kind of trio of kind of hybrid helmets with starting with the Cast Nirvana, which just has like little tiny ear covers, going through to the POC, which is that Ben Healy wore in the Tour de France, which has half ear covers, and then going through to a laser helmet which has full ear covers. Now, the laser helmet does kind of muffle your hearing a little bit, and that's something that a full plastic TT helmet can do. But on the other hand, a helmet that covers more of your head might be safer. We don't really know. The UCI hasn't presented any evidence one way or another. And what I would like to see is more prescriptive helmet regulations that determine size, shape, how the number of vents, how big they have to be, and also higher safety standards than just the kind of the relevant basic international standards that really are not designed to account for riders careering down mountains at 100 kilometers per hour.
Yeah, I mean, helmet safety is, I think the way it's tested visibly, publicly, that is, has changed quite significantly. Virginia Tech, all credit to them. I'm sure there are flaws in the way it's tested. It could be done different ways, whatever. But like they have actually standardized this stuff in a fairly good, repeatable, measurable way.
But am I right in thinking that their testing goes well above and beyond
Exactly.
the minimum basic testing that the UCI is prescribing, and that's the problem for me.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I was going to say, like with them, why are they not being involved with these conversations? Why couldn't, when we are in this era of, I don't know, for whatever reason, now is the time where that testing is being done, that resource is available, tell pro teams that they have to have a 5-star helmet according to Virginia Tech, or whoever. It's an illustrative point.
Ollie and I were discussing this in the office earlier, but if you look at, say, skiing, for example, there are available, or even well, something the UCI manages, downhill mountain biking. Everyone wears a full face helmet there with a chin guard. Is that what you call it? Why are riders not wearing kind of lightweight titanium or carbon fiber chin guards that don't block your ability to eat or breathe whilst on the bike, but just provide a little bit of extra protection? That is something that the UCI could investigate, could mandate, but appears to have kind of no appetite to do.
Probably because it would look naff and they wouldn't like it.
Do they still have in the rules something about preserving the image of the sport?
I would have thought so. I'd be surprised if not.
Because that's always been their party line for a lot of these silly changes. And it's like, well, it's such a subjective measure, like the image of the sport. If you were born in 2005, the image of your sport is totally different to the image of someone who's born in the 70s.
It's a very good point.
Like otherwise, we'd all be riding around in sweatbands on 19 mil.
But I think it goes back to
Hillclimb days.
Yes, totally.
I think it goes back to what Michael Wood said in his Tour de France blog, where the kind of he said that the riders were basically in the pre-race briefing threatened with this idea that they were going to have to be made to warn safety equipment if they didn't kind of ride a bit safer or whatever. And Michael Woods was kind of saying, yeah, why aren't we wearing safety equipment? Wouldn't that be a great rule to implement? Because no one's going to just wear it out of choice, because the performance downsides from current safety equipment, which on the whole is not designed for road cycling and is therefore not designed to be lightweight, breathable, aerodynamic.
Didn't he?
Yeah, but that
made for a great headline.
Yeah, but if that's the kind of thing that could almost instantly affect rider outcomes in the event of crashes. We don't know what the effects of handlebar whips, gearing, all of this, banning time trial helmets will be. Maybe the effects will all be good, as we say. It's a very laudable thing to look at improving safety in the sport, but it does seem that we're kind of looking in weird places rather than at kind of the obvious things that downhill mountain bikers, they all wear protective equipment, chin bars, full face big helmets.
Yeah, I had a good tidbit actually from Rob Weaver, our tech ed on mountain biking. I didn't realise this, but quite a lot of teams are really conscious about their safety. What a surprise. And Troy Lee Designs makes a lot of I think it was Troy Lee or maybe it was Fox, I can't remember exactly, but basically one brand quite frequently use motocross helmets repainted because they're safer, and that's it. Partly because the teams that sponsor them or the brands that sponsor them don't necessarily make the helmets they want, but they're really active, no, I'll have the bigger helmet, please. That would be fantastic. On the subject of weird things, how can I resist?
Why are you pointing at me?
How can I resist such a fabulous segue? But what better point to finish on than the sock height rule? I mean, the most controversial, derided rule that the UCI has possibly ever introduced. Simon, I mean, you're wearing ankle socks today, so perhaps you're not the man to comment on this.
I'm channeling my inner Primoz Roglic.
Tell us what the sock height rule is and why you think it needs to change.
So the sock height rule was introduced, maybe 20... Well, since I've worked at BikeRadar, isn't it?
Because 2020s.
Something around that. And there's a great picture. Someone snapped an amazing picture of a Sunweb rider having their kind of overshoes measured, but your socks are not allowed to extend past the middle point of your calf, basically. And the UCI, as it loves to do, develop their own, not just say you can have 10 centimetre socks. That was too easy. I suppose in an effort to make it more proportional, they developed their own little tool that basically puts a little dot on your knee and then a dot on your ankle joint, and then it's like a protractor. It kind of measures that midpoint between the two, and that's how they determine the maximum required sock height. Now, the reason that they introduced this is because obviously long socks made of aerodynamic material can be more aerodynamic than just bare legs. So, as we see in UK time trialing and triathlon, people wear really long socks to make themselves go a little bit faster. But UCI just didn't like the way it looked, as far as we can tell. There's no safety reason to ban long socks. People just don't like the way it looked. So I just don't think there should be a rule
It's just
around
a
this stuff. It's
distraction.
just a distraction. If people, you can say, oh, well, we just don't like the way it looks, but is that a good way to be running the sport? Maybe. If you want the sport to feel accessible to everyday people, you don't want it to look like Formula One too much, and you don't want to be too removed from the way that people ride bikes. That's a reasonable argument, and we can have that discussion. But at the end of the day, we are talking about elite sport, and it is never going to feel like Joe Bloggs, riding to the shops, and it shouldn't.
No. Ollie, do you ever tickle with UCI illegal socks in your racing days?
I don't know about UCI illegal. I think I've got quite short legs, so most socks look quite long.
So it's possible you could be infringing the rules.
Yeah, and it does look daft.
If only you won races, you might get disqualified.
Well, this is the thing. This is the problem.
I don't know why.
There's no tangible benefit to me wearing them because I'm still crap. So, yeah, I think exactly. It's another silly little distraction, isn't it? And I think there's a million other things the UCI should be focusing on.
We're going to talk a little bit more about measurements and the sort of UCI's approach to rulemaking in our rant of the week in a moment. But now we're going to turn to last week's top performing content as chosen by your clicks on BikeRadar.com. Your peek behind the curtain. Your desperately, urgently, juicy look at Google Analytics for BikeRadar. And last week's top performing story had nothing to do with road cycling. It was a really good head-to-head test by our wonderful Tom Marvin between a hardtail, a sort of soft tail style mountain bike, and a full suspension mountain bike. It's a terrific read, genuinely really, really good. I even sent him a nice email saying how much I enjoyed it. It was very, very well written and answers a very hot, interesting question in the world of mountain biking, where particularly these soft tail mountain bikes have made a bit of a splash. There's more choice than ever for racers on the mountain bike side, and it's the sort of bike you actually see out and about these days. Very, very good read and well worth a click. Bringing it back to this conversation, though, I think something that struck me is, this is cross-country racing alone. We're kind of ignoring the other disciplines in mountain biking here. And that is a snapshot of, the variety and excitement and the, amazing development that's going on the mountain biking side. And none of this, navel-gazing, worrying is taking place on the mountain bike side. 32-inch wheels being the exception. There has been a little bit of furore, if you like, there on the mountain bike side. But that is one or two bikes which are being tested at the fringes. At the core of the sport, there are loads of cool things happening. And the UCI is not ruining anyone's fun, as far as we can tell. Mountain biking feels much, much freer. Simon, you're a man who often comments in the podcast that you look at mountain bikes and not only comment on their extraordinary value for money compared to road bikes, but also on the tech as a whole. Did you read Tom Marvin's wonderful piece?
I actually missed this one, but it did, as you say, it does kind of raise that point that the world of mountain biking is so kind of technologically advanced compared to the world of road cycling. And I occasionally do turn on and watch a little bit of XC World Cup racing, and it's interesting to see things that relevant to this discussion, that you can have a lefty fork, for example, on the Cannondale Scalpel. You cannot have a lefty fork on a Cannondale road bike. In a UCI race, so
and maybe it would be better for all we know.
Well,
but it's just banned outright.
Clearly it's not a safety thing on the road. If you can have a lefty fork for a mountain bike that's raced at an elite level, clearly it's not that you can't build a single-legged fork that isn't safe enough for road use or whatever. So, yeah, I don't really know why the UCI seems to regulate mountain biking so differently to road. It might just be purely because road cycling has this historical thing that we're trying to preserve, obviously mountain bike just doesn't have that. It comes from a kind of much more modern space, relatively speaking, but it is it's a confusing one.
I would say that there's definitely no shortage of criticism of the UCI in the mountain biking world. I just think the nature of it is slightly different and it's less nitpicky than it is perhaps on the road side. Ollie Smith, I should hope that so fresh into BikeRadar, you're reading every single thing that's published on the website. But which of these three bikes would take your fancy as a man who has dabbled here and there with mountain bike racing?
Well, I have a hardtail, so that Cannondale, as nice as it is, I've already got a hardtail. But the World Cup Epic, I think, has always been on my list as a nice mid-ground. I think it's the perfect for the riding I like doing. I think a full sus, I wouldn't really know what to do with it. I'd sort of just get myself in quite a lot of trouble. But a Softail, I feel like would be just a nice, like, because what is it if not a flat bar gravel bike, right? Like a Softail cross-country mountain bike.
When we say Softail, then explain this to me. What is a Softail compared to a full suspension?
A full suspension mountain bike with less travel than normal, but they also usually require or rely on a slightly more flexible rear end, so they're less complicated, they're lighter, more like a hardtail. That Epic in particular is effectively like a hardtail when it's locked out. It's a very cool bike, but that's not today's primary subject. But it is a really good article. I would implore you to go and click at the link in the description to read it. There is also going to be a video on the MB UK TV channel, and I'm also going to rope Tom Marvin into coming onto the BikeRadar podcast for a rare reappearance to discuss this very article. But yeah, we're going to round out with the rant of the week as ever, and the TLDR of this one is, Dear UCI, please be more professional. Now, there is lots that you can unpick with this one, not least the fact that we always email the UCI, as do all our other contemporaries, and ask them for comment on these various stories, and they never engage with us, nor do I really expect that that'll change, given we've spent many podcasts beefing on them. But it'd be really good to have them on to actually discuss this stuff and get the rationale behind the rules and to regain some of that social equity, as Ollie so eloquently put it. But aside from anything else, these rules seem to really be introduced on a bit of a whim, and rules are far too open to interpretation, but there are a couple of absolutely fantastic nuggets that Simon's pulled out from the rulebook that are really worth highlighting, which demonstrate this point very clearly.
I think if you've ever spent any time reading the UCI rules, the technical regulations, I do it so you don't have to. But it's kind of like a patchwork quilt of rules applied in reaction to stuff. And
the way it's formatted, I add with this as well, is very patchwork-like. It's very graphic designers .png, sort of like a notice board.
Yeah, it's just missing the word art title.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. Then there's like a load of old pictures that have kind of as these rules have been added in response to people doing things, the kind of pictures have stayed the same, and so you've got kind of like weird pictures of there's Jack and I did photography degrees. That's how we ended up with this proper job. But there's if you didn't have the context of the rules and you just saw the photos in isolation, like an art gallery, there's so weird, like a kind of a latex hand in a mitten on like a white piece of paper on a table, or like a disembodied hand placing a credit card between a bike and a wheel, and so for example, that kind of credit card one is that introduced in an era where bikes were starting to kind of wrap the seat tube around the rear wheel in a kind of direct the airflow around the rear wheel in a kind of attempt to make a fairing, essentially. Now, fairings are banned by the UCI. We're not all riding faired, what do you call them?
Velomobiles.
Yeah, faired velomobiles. Maybe we should be, but we're not. But the rule to kind of determine the minimum clearance between your frame and the rear wheel is not, well, it must be 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters or whatever. It's just that it says it must be possible to fit a thin, flat object, brackets such as a credit card, between insert that between the frame and the rear wheel without that thing bending. And so the rule literally quotes credit card and has a picture of a guy using a credit card, but it's like, well, Is credit card a standard thing? Is credit card
an SI unit credit card?
How many credit cards tall are you?
Yeah, and could someone bring their own credit card and dispute the UCI's credit card?
I'm just scrolling through as you're talking through this now.
There are other weird things like there's a picture, I think it was, of David Miller's time trial bike from his Garmin Sharp era, where he had a kind of carbon fiber chainring cover that he used to make his bike slightly more aero, and you can't have that because that is a fairing that you have added, and that makes your bike more aerodynamic. But what you can have, if you've got loads of money, is a €600 full carbon aerodynamic crank. That's absolutely fine.
I'm looking at this crank as we speak, and it's actually not a million miles away from those time cranks that came with the complete bikes, the all-in-one. I can't remember what they're called, but they were effectively like a big fairing attached to the crank.
Yeah, and of course, so there's for the UK time trialists among you, there's a company called Easy Gains that makes disc wheel covers, aero crank covers, for example. Now, disc wheel covers are also not allowed. Those are adding kind of clip-on covers to your rear wheel that turn your kind of standard rear wheel into a full disc wheel, but that's not allowed because that's a fairing. But if you've got loads of money and you can afford a fully integrated disc wheel, you can spend £3,000 dollars or pounds on one, then that's fantastic, and more power to you according to the UCI. So those are all silly. I think the kind of bigger problem, it seems to be the kind of lack of real genuine engagement with stakeholders. When the kind of UCI announced the handlebar thing, they did so in a kind of press release that just got sent out to people, and it was actually Daniel Benson, again, friend of the BikeRadar podcast,
Very much friend, yep.
The excellent Daniel Benson, who picked up on this, and then the kind of the story kind of rumbled on there with everyone picking up on it and everyone asking questions. The person that we spoke to basically said that they felt ignored by the UCI, despite being a key stakeholder in the kind of meetings that were going on to discuss these potential rule changes. And considering the kind of comments that other people have made in the kind of aftermath, that they weren't isolated in that feeling. So, and then like you say, we have tried to reach out to the UCI and find out what's going on. Just like us, I'm sure the people who run the UCI are people,
Of course.
and I'm sure they're doing this for reasons that they believe in. But then, if that's the case, it would be fantastic if they could explain those reasons. I think the era of unaccountable governing bodies should be in the past. The UCI, the UCI should not be FIFA. It doesn't have enough money to be FIFA. Heaven knows the cycling industry is not awash for cash. But it's just disappointing that we get things like this, things that affect the sport, people's professions. It doesn't affect everyday riders to the extent, but professional people, professional bike riders are also people. This is their livelihoods, this is their job. These rules are going to affect them. If they are not able to perform as well next season because their sponsors can't react quickly enough to the new rules to get them kit that is as good as the other, that's going to affect their incomes by affecting their results.
And cycling is also a sport which doesn't wait for anybody. It's not a, you can't be a top athlete forever and ever and ever. And if you have one bad season because you are a tiny rider, you are microscopically small and an incredible climber, but you're on a 6.8 kilo bike with bars that are like mountain bike bars for you, like that could really have a significant impact on you. And the unaccountability is a really good point. Like I don't think we dwell on it quite enough, but I just think it's wild that there's absolutely no engagement at all externally with this. Like either with us, the media, or more to the point, with like the people who are involved with the decision making, the people who are actually kind of involved, like our source throughout all of this. It's a funny old business. Ollie,
I do think it's funny how very few brands like really take a stand on it. Like just looking at this UCI guide here, there's a photo of that Endura. Is it the encapsulator?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
The rubber bits.
Oh, yes, I recall.
Do you remember what happened with that? It got banned, and then Enduro just pulled out of sponsoring. I think it must have just been Movistar at the time. And they were like, no, that's it. We're not going to play your game. We don't want to engage with your like silly rules that keep changing. Like, we've developed this product. It's perfectly safe. It works really well. It's obviously good, because I think Movistar had quite a good year. And you said banned it, Enduro were like, all right, fine. And they just walked away. And I'm saying that I don't know what state Enduro are in right now. But it's a pretty bold stance, and I feel like if more brands did that, would it like generate enough kind of weight?
Well, we've seen Swisside, for example. They developed those Hadron 680 wheels, in compliance with the rules as they stood, and then I think it was something like, they released an open letter and basically said 2 weeks before they were due to launch these wheels, the UCI were like, oh, actually, no, you can't have 68mm deep rims from next year. Nothing taller than 65mm. And again, Swisside argument was that rim height in isolation has very little to do with stability, and actually like what tire you run on your rims has more to do with handling stability than rim depth, for example. But again, Swisside came out with its own data. The UCI didn't have any. Now, if it has some data and it has experimented with these things and has proof that limiting rim heights to 65mm will improve safety in the pro peloton because of XYZ, fantastic. But I think it's not unfair for people to ask them to share that.
I think that's a good point to end on. Yes, it's been a really rough ride for the UCI this whole year, but I dare say a bit of a mess of their own making. I'm looking forward to seeing how it all pans out. I really don't see a world in which they're going to back down. I cannot fathom a point where they are going to admit that they've got egg on their face and have made some quite significant mistakes this year. Like, clearly there's a long history of controversial UCI rulemaking, but as I said before, the sort of like rudderlessness of it this year today has been quite unusual. And hopefully there's positive change in future, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
I think, if we look back to the situation with disc brakes, for example, where there was kind of no real rules against them when disc brakes on road bikes first kind of started appearing.
This is a real stamp on the BikeRadar podcast. Bingo card.
Bring up
Disc
the disc
brakes.
brakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk about wax chain soon.
Oh, don't get me started.
Yeah.
How long have you got? The UCI, they were initially allowed because there weren't any rules against them. People started using them. People complained, people, they're going to chop off my fingers, all of that sort of stuff. And so therefore the UCI then banned them. And then but because there was so much pressure from the industry, big players like Giant, Shimano, all the bike brands were kind of in on this. The UCI eventually had to sort of say, well, you have to chamfer the edges of your disc brake rotors, and then and only then will they be allowed. And so now obviously we have reached a kind of point where, yes, disc brakes are allowed in UCI racing.
And no one's losing their fingers.
As far as we know.
As far as we know.
So it could be that, the UCI will introduce these regulations and then seek to refine them or even change them as time goes on. And, I hope that's the case. But again, it comes back to that issue of communication. I think the UCI has a responsibility to communicate with people. I know, again, maybe they're communicating with professional teams and brands behind the scene, but if you're an amateur racer, for example, and you've just brought that POC semi-aero helmet, TT helmet thingy, you've brought that. You've paid £350 for it or whatever, under the kind of in good faith thinking that this is UCI legal. But then what happens if from January the 1st, 2026, that's suddenly not legal? You turn up to your local road race and the guy who's running the kind of British cycling, which is run under UCI regulation, says, well, I'm sorry, you can't wear that. That's not legal. And you go, well, this is the helmet that I have. I guess I'm going home. That's not good for the sport. Getting into situations like that is not good for the sport. And it's the same with all types of things. If you've got a set of, if you've gone really to town and you've brought a set of 70mm deep rims or something like that you want to use for triathlon, road racing, and time trial, and then you just can't use those. And those are the wheels that you have. It's just a really bad situation, and I just don't think you can introduce rules like this with such short lead times without any kind of clear communications about why you're doing it, what the benefits will be, and it's just, I think it's outstanding.
What size are your bars?
Right now?
Yeah.
35s.
Banned.
Tell me about it.
Out.
But my helmet is a normal road helmet. I don't wear a TT helmet.
How many vents has it got?
It's got enough, I think.
Enough.
The regulated amount.
We will see.
I can't believe they let people race in helmets that like completely cover your ears. I think that's dumb.
But we don't. Again, I know what you're saying, and obviously, we all do use our hearing so you can listen to people helpfully shout, "Hold your line." Outside, coming on the outside, up. But we don't stop deaf people from riding. So the hearing issue alone is not enough. So I think whilst I agree with you that limiting your hearing is not a good idea in a situation where you do want to use all of your senses to react to things and keep yourself safe. There are also, again, there's not enough. This doesn't feel like evidence-based regulation.
That's enough. The UCI have had enough airtime today. I really do think it's going to be an interesting, particularly start to the new season. January is going to be really busy, I reckon, with loads of weird setups, things to unpick. Maybe we should go to the Tour Down Under. That'd be good fun. Go see some cool bikes. Anyway.
And some kangaroos.
In the meantime, thank you very, very, very much for listening or watching. It's been really good fun. Welcome back to Simon. I very much missed you in your time off. And of course, welcome to Ollie for joining us as a fresh-ish guest onto the podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, comments, leads, any message you want to send through to the UCI, either leave those in the comments or email us at podcast@bikeradar.com. And if you don't already, subscribe to the podcast wherever you choose to get your podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. It matters a great deal to us, or a thumbs up on YouTube. Whatever you want to do, just give us some love. It means a great deal. Thank you again. Speak to you again soon.